just how do you become a Buddha? That's the question I'll look at in today's video. That is, these perfections, these virtues that need to be perfected in order to become a Buddha. What are they? And we'll look at that in today's video. First of all, I'll look at the history of these perfections a little bit, and then we'll turn to one list of them as found in the Theravāda tradition. Now, to be clear, this idea of perfections, what are known as the pāramīs or paramitas, these perfections are not a part of the early Buddhist practice. We don't find lists of perfections in early Buddhism. Although individually each of the perfections are of course discussed in the early tradition, there isn't a practice involving the group as a group in early Buddhism. And in particular, there's no idea in early Buddhism of one trying to become a full Buddha. That is something that arose later on after the Buddha's lifetime. And so it's after the Buddha's lifetime that we get these kinds of lists of perfections that one needs to perfect, in other words, list of virtues that one needs to perfect in order to become a full Buddha. Now, what exactly is the difference between being a full Buddha on the one hand and just an enlightened being on the other? That's a deep and detailed question. I did a separate video on that. I'll leave a link to that down below in the notes. But we'll simply, for the purposes of this video, be aware that there is a difference here. It may be subtle, but nevertheless there is a difference between being a full Buddha and being an arahant or an enlightened being. Now, generally the idea of looking towards full Buddhahood as opposed to looking to become simply enlightened is understood to be an aspect of the Mahāyāna tradition, the tradition that came later than early Buddhism. It's a somewhat later tradition. And we think of that as what's known as sort of the bodhisattva path, where one becomes a bodhisattva, which is somebody who is looking towards this aim of becoming a full Buddha. However, it's important to note that this path didn't only exist in the Mahāyāna, that we also find it in the Theravāda tradition as well. Now, it's not entirely clear historically where this idea originated from, at least in the Theravāda tradition. It may have originated in or around the time of what's known as the Buddhavamsa, which is a text in the 1st or 2nd century BCE, which was therefore originated around the time of the beginnings, very beginnings of the Mahāyāna, which may have begun to be originated around the 1st century before the Common Era as well. However, the idea of these perfections, at least in the Theravāda, were perhaps most fully explained in a medieval text by Acharya Dhammapāla, which was recently translated by Bhikkhu Bodhi. And it's that text that I'll be looking to today to describe this list of perfections that we find. Now, there is a rough parallelism between the perfections that we find in this text that I'll be discussing today and the list of perfections that we ordinarily find in the Mahāyāna. And this parallelism probably means that this notion of perfections originated some earlier time, either pre-sectarian, that is before we had this split of Buddhism into sects, or at least pre-Mahāyāna, that these ideas of perfections went back to an earlier time, sometime after the Buddha's lifetime, but before the creation of these different ideas within Buddhism, so that there's a sort of a common core, a rough common core, that then was split off into the various traditions, which then each tradition gives this list its own kind of flavor. And then the ideas behind them sort of evolved as each of the schools evolved. And as the idea evolved of a bodhisattva, this idea of a path of practice that would take potentially eons of lifetimes, many, many millions of lifetimes in order to realize the goal of becoming a full Buddha. Because the goal of becoming a full Buddha is quite a bit more difficult than that of becoming a mere arahant, a mere quote-unquote enlightened being. And so we'll look at that a bit, but in any event, the difference as this notion of a path, a long path evolved, then also this notion of these great perfections also evolved. Now, within the Theravāda tradition, in particular in this text that we'll be using today by Dhammapāla, it's said that there are 10 perfections. And I'll put a list of those 10 perfections here on the screen, and what I'm going to do is to go through each of them in turn and discuss some of what Dhammapāla had to say about each. Obviously, I'm only going to be able to say a certain amount. It's quite a long text. If you want to read it, I'll leave a link to it down below in the notes. And he has quite a lot to say about each of the perfections. I'll only be giving a short introduction to each of them today. So the first of these perfections is giving. Now, why is this first? What is its position on this list? It's said, Dhammapāla says, that the reason it's first is that it's the easiest of the perfections to practice, and it's the least fruitful, he says. What is certainly true is that the Buddha, when he was alive, oftentimes would begin his discussion of the Dharma when he was talking about it with new people, with new practitioners, with lay people who potentially had never heard about the Buddha's teaching before. He would begin by talking about generosity, giving. The idea being that this is a practice which is open to everybody, and in particular the lay community needed to support the Sangha of monastics by giving them donations of food, of clothing, of housing, and so on. And so, as a result, that's the place that the Buddha would always begin. That is also then, therefore, the first of these perfections, or the first of these virtues that needs to be perfected in order to become a Buddha. Now, Dhammapāla says that this is the easiest to practice. However, as the long hagiographical stories of the Buddha were constructed, that is to say, the Buddha's prior lifetimes, the perfection involved with giving became graver and graver. So it's not simply an idea of giving food or money, but it became one of giving literally everything that we own, giving our family. There's a story of a Buddha in a prior lifetime giving his spouse and children, which is something that Dhammapāla comments upon in his text by saying, you shouldn't do this unless you have basically the support and acquiescence of the wife and children to do this. This is something that we might say is an example of this having occurred in an androcentric society where family members were sort of considered possessions of the male of the family. But these are facts of the culture in which these ideas arose. And also, there's the idea of even giving your own life in support of other people. Real self-sacrifice. So, although this is the first on the list, it's actually not so easy to practice as might seem. Now, the second of these so-called virtues to be perfected is the virtue of what's called virtue. We might say ethical virtue or moral virtue. These are the ethical practices that one undertakes to not harm other beings. They're basically, what Dhammapāla says about this is that while the first of these perfections is one of giving, so it benefits others, this one is, in a sense, better because it not only benefits but also doesn't harm others. So it takes away harm, it takes away worry from those around us because we have committed to virtue, to this kind of ethical practice. Within Buddhism, these ethical practices they're often known as the 5 precepts, that is, not to kill, not to steal, not to commit sexual misconduct, not to lie, and not to abuse intoxicants, because the abuse of intoxicants might lead us to commit one of the first 4 problems in harming others. And also, it involves, let's say, right livelihood, that we don't involve ourselves in livelihoods that are harmful towards other people. So that is at least the second of these perfections. The third virtue to be perfected is renunciation. Now, there are many ways to understand renunciation here, and Dhammapāla goes through many of them. We might begin by saying, look, you're going to renounce bad behaviors. In a certain sense, that goes along with what we've just said in our previous virtue here. So part of it is renouncing things that we ordinarily might do that might harm others in our lives or in our livelihoods. However, more deeply, Dhammapāla considers this renunciation to be a mental practice, a practice of renouncing bad ways of thinking. For example, renouncing greed, renouncing hatred, renouncing delusions of various kinds. Or in a general sense, renouncing what are called the hindrances, these afflictive mental states that make it difficult for us to reach deep states of meditation, meditative absorption. So if we're renouncing these afflictive mental states, we're going to be undertaking practices over long periods of time to purify our minds, to make ourselves calmer, make ourselves, let's say, wiser and kinder towards others. We're renouncing all kinds of difficulties for ourselves. That's our practice. And through doing that, we're going to be able to reach these deep states of meditative absorption more easily, these very, very pleasant states of meditative absorption. I've done videos on them in the past. They're known as the jhanas. Within early Buddhism, there are other ones as well, but the most famous ones are the jhanas. And so this idea of renunciation can be seen as another way to describe jhanic meditation. The fourth virtue to be perfected in order to become a Buddha is the virtue of wisdom. Now, to my mind, it's somewhat odd that this perfection comes fourth instead of coming last, because in this list, at least on its surface, it does seem as though we're progressing from easier to harder, from lighter to deeper in terms of our virtues. After all, we began with giving, which Dhammapāla says is first because it's the easiest. That might lead us to think that as we get farther along, these virtues become more and more deep, they become more and more difficult. And in that, if we consider this list in that progression, we might think that wisdom would come last. After all, it's wisdom that sort of is, at least in many ways in Buddhism, considered the sort of the culmination of our practice. Within the Mahāyāna tradition, there's often discussion of what's known as prajñā paramita, or the perfection of wisdom. That is indeed in some lists of these perfections within that tradition, within the Mahāyāna tradition, that perfection of wisdom comes last. And it comes last for a reason, because it's that perfection which sort of caps and culminates the entire list of perfections. Now, it may be that this is actually evidence of an early core of perfections, of virtues, which might have been only four within perhaps a pre-Theravāda tradition that was later expanded after this. In other words, this may have been the last, and then other ones were added afterwards because it was noticed that this small core wasn't really sufficient to describe all that was needed to be described. In that case, there might be a parallel between this and the shorter list we find in the Mahāyāna. There are various lists in the Mahāyāna, but one of the most famous is a short list of 6 that ends again in wisdom. Now, all that said, Dhammapāla says that this virtue of wisdom follows the one we've just seen of renunciation because it's calm. It's the calm that comes out of renunciation that produces wisdom. And I think we can understand that by seeing that it's only after really being able to renounce much of our ordinary life, renounce the sort of distractions of the ordinary world, that we're able to get our mind to a place, that is to say, outside of these afflictive states, having renounced the afflictive states of greed, of hatred, and so on. Only once we're in that position are we in a position to truly cultivate wisdom. Now, the fifth one of these virtues is energy. And Dhammapāla says that this comes fifth because wisdom is itself sort of perfected by energy. That is to say that wisdom without energy is kind of useless, whereas wisdom with energy really gets us farther along the path. Now, I'm not exactly sure about the reasoning here about why energy comes after wisdom. I wouldn't have necessarily thought that energy was more difficult or deeper than wisdom, but in any event, that's the description we get. And I think we can at least understand the point here, which is that if we are going to go on this eons-long journey to become a Buddha, that's going to be a journey that takes a lot of energy, that will need a lot of energy on our part. And so we really do need to focus on any way we can to increase our level of energy in our lives so that we can keep practicing. The sixth one of these virtues is the virtue of patience. It's a virtue that I myself need to work on. But I think we can understand really easily why patience is so important, particularly as, again, the route to becoming a Buddha, the route that we're taking, the route towards our goal, it becomes much more lengthened. In the early tradition, the route was one simply of becoming enlightened, which is a route that could potentially be done within a single lifetime. At least that was how it was described by the Buddha himself. However, as we left that route behind and instead took the longer route to becoming a full Buddha, all of a sudden we need an enormous amount of time to achieve that. After all, a full Buddha only arises in a world where the Dharma is unknown, where the Dharma has been lost. And then the full Buddha has to arise in such a place and be able to discover the Dharma, disseminate the Dharma, and produce a sangha of monastics, of believers, of followers, who are going to distribute knowledge of this Dharma around the world. That clearly only will happen in certain very special circumstances. So if we're waiting for such a place to be reborn, I mean, if this is, of course, we're being involved here in this whole traditional notion of rebirth over many lifetimes, if that's where we're going, then we're going to need a lot of patience in order to get there. And in particular, Dhammapāla talks about how we have to not be craving rewards. Because insofar as we crave rewards on our path, we're going to become discouraged very quickly. Because again, this is such a long path over so many billions and billions of lifetimes that any craving for immediate success or reward is likely to be thwarted. On the other hand, we also have to be somebody willing to put up with a lot of pain and adversity. Because, once again, this is going to take such a long time, so many rounds of birth and death, so many rounds of old age and sickness, not only so many, but so many millions and billions, that we're going to need a kind of, we might even say, supernatural kind of patience in order to be able to put up with all of that in order to reach our final goal. The seventh of these perfections is the perfection of truthfulness. This has a couple of different connotations here according to Dhammapāla. The first one is truthfulness in speech, that is to say, we don't lie. Now, to my mind, that sounds like very much like the second of these perfections, that of virtue itself, which is involved with not killing, stealing, committing sexual misconduct, lying, and so on. So that seems like a virtue that we've already discussed. On the other hand, Dhammapāla also says that there's a second connotation here, which is that it's truthfulness in vision, essentially, truthfulness in seeing, in understanding the world. In other words, that we see the world clearly as it really is. In particular, that we see that there are no permanent selves, that we see the world in, we might say, in terms of dukkha, that is, that the world is unsatisfactory in various respects, that the world is non-self, that the world is always changeable, these kinds of ways of understanding the world that are not involved in delusion. The eighth virtue is known as the virtue of determination. That is, our refusal to vacillate, to waver or wobble on our way to attaining Buddhahood. This virtue is related to the Mahāyāna idea of the vow. Within the Mahāyāna tradition, there is this notion that we take what are known as bodhisattva vows, that we vow or promise to attain full Buddhahood for the sake of all enlightened beings, or I should say for the sake of all beings. And what we find here within this tradition, within the Theravāda tradition, is this notion, however, that this determination cannot be made simply by anybody. Within the Mahāyāna, it's sort of the sort of thing that's relatively open to everyone, although it is indeed understood that most people who make these vows will eventually fall away from them. Within the Theravāda tradition, on the other hand, there's the idea that this kind of determination only really has power if made in the presence of a living Buddha who then predicts that we will become a Buddha ourselves. This is actually reflects an early story, or a story from the, shall we say, the tradition just after the Buddha's lifetime, most likely. A story about one of the Buddha's prior lives, where it's said that the Buddha went to another, I should say the Buddha that we know and love, Gautama, in a prior lifetime, many, many eons ago, made a determination in front of a Buddha at that time, and the Buddha at that time made a prediction, yes, you will become Buddha yourself. That, according to many in the Theravāda tradition, is really the only way that you can make an effective determination to become a Buddha. Otherwise, you may make a determination, but there's no real reason to believe it's going to be effective. It's also further said by Dhammapāla here that only a monastic can make such a determination. That we need, that is to say, you need a level of determination in your own life right now to have the determination to make such a determination, shall we say. So your ordinary layperson sort of doesn't have the right mindset to be able to make this determination appropriately. You have to be a monastic in order to do it. The ninth perfection is one of loving kindness, or kindness towards others. And it's said that this is the ninth perfection that follows determination, because when we make a determination, we're not making it simply for ourselves, but we're making it for the benefit of all sentient beings, of all beings. Now, this represents something of a subtle shift from the understanding of attaining the goal in early Buddhism. In early Buddhism, the attainment of the goal was seen more as a way to escape ourselves from the round of rebirth and samsara than it was seen as an outward-directed attempt to help all sentient beings. The point in early Buddhism was to essentially perfect ourselves, to escape our own imperfections, to purify our minds, and therefore to become free. The later paths within the Mahāyāna, and as we're seeing in this video, the Theravāda as well, it's a little bit more outward directed towards the effect we might have on the larger world. That said, even within the early tradition, there was very much the idea that monastics and enlightened people would be expected to, and indeed would, teach others, help others, bring the Dharma out in the world, make the world a better place. So it's not as though in the early tradition one was simply doing this out of selfish aims. Rather was the idea that until you had actually perfected your mind and purified your mind, you weren't really able to act unselfishly. That the person with the unperfected or unpurified mind would, as a matter of course, tend to act in the world out of greed and hatred at least some of the time. So the aim of becoming purified and enlightened within this lifetime was one of putting yourself in a position where you could act with the most egoless kind of kindness possible. Therefore, it's really not correct to say that the early tradition was selfish in a way that the later tradition is not. That's really a slur on the early tradition. It's rather to say that there was a slightly different focus on how that outward directedness is to be understood. The 10th and final perfection is one of equanimity. Now, why is this last? Dhammapāla says that this is last because equanimity perfects loving kindness or kindness. Both of these, that is to say kindness or loving kindness and equanimity, both of these are Brahmaviharas. The Brahmaviharas is a list of 4 emotional states that are very beneficial to us that we practice within the early tradition in order to make ourselves better and to make our mind purer and to make ourselves more helpful. These are loving kindness on the one hand, compassion towards others who are suffering, sympathetic joy, that is joy in the success of others, and equanimity as the 4th. So equanimity here is sort of the capstone of the Brahmaviharas. And here, the perfection is one that follows that of loving kindness. Now, what is more we can say about this? One thing we can say is that it's equanimity that helps us to be helpful towards, kind towards those who are doing bad things. Because ordinarily, without equanimity, we might turn away from those who are doing evil or bad things in the world and not want to focus our kindness on them. Either we're angry at them, we're unkind towards them, or we simply want to leave them to one side because we're not really interested in such people. However, from the point of view of equanimity, we might even say that people who are doing wrong things particularly need our kindness. Certainly they don't need to be avoided by us. Our kindness must be distributed to them as well in order that they may learn, perhaps from our example even, or be calmed by our example, or that their hatred may diminish through our example, and that they can become better people too. Further, it's said that equanimity will help us not to be partial towards those who are favorable to us. Because once again, without equanimity, we might have people who are very kind towards us, very friendly, very generous towards us, and we may decide that we're going to give them special favor. That's, again, a very ordinary kind of way of living in the world, of giving special favor to people who are nice to us. But once again, that can lead to kinds of blindness, where perhaps those who are close to us or those who are kind to us may not be good people for some reason. They may have their own faults. In fact, they probably do have their own faults. And we need to be open to that and aware of that, and so not spend time simply being kind to people who are nice to us, but again, be equanimous. That is to say that our kindness, our loving kindness, should be universal and therefore unconditional. And that is the aim, that is the final goal here really with this list of 10 of these perfections, is trying to achieve a place of unconditional, sort of undirected in the sense of not directed in any particular person or people, unconditional kindness, compassion. That is sort of the place of the full Buddha, at least as in this understanding. Now, after having given this list of 10 perfections, Dhammapāla goes on to describe how this list is essentially the same as that found in some lists in the Mahāyāna. In particular, the very famous list of 6 perfections, or pāramīs, that we find in the Mahāyāna, of giving, virtue, patience, energy, meditation, and wisdom. The only really different part of these lists that don't quite mesh is that of meditation in the Mahāyāna, which, as I say, Dhammapāla believes is expressed in this notion of renunciation within the Theravāda list, that these are basically the same thing. And indeed, Dhammapāla has quite a bit to say about that. It's quite interesting how he describes the similarities. So we can see these as essentially the same kinds of lists, and coming out of a tradition of the Bodhisattva, that our path is a path of becoming a Bodhisattva rather than the path of becoming what's known as an Arahant or an enlightened being. Now, one might ask, what is the Bodhisattva path and where does it come from? That is really the root of the issue here with respect to these perfections. And I did an earlier video on that question. I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to refresh your memory. If you're getting something out of these videos, take a look over at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.